There are some cases that are made for newspaper headlines. Cases where the victim is someone who grabs our attention, either by their fame or their innocence. An interesting or even nefarious defendant can help make a story intriguing, and a good lawyer can elevate the case from mundane to noteworthy as well. Put them all together, and they're usually labeled the case of the century. Tabloids love them because they sell papers, but once they're over, they're usually just forgotten about, consigned to the trash heap of history. Few cases haunt us. There's O.J. Simpson, there's the Manson family, but rarely do cases change the way we, as society, think and feel about crime or its consequences. Today's case is the case of the 20th century. Leopold and Loeb, today on the Noir Factory.
Noir, suspense, true crime, hard-boiled fiction. Explore the dark alleys and cheap gin joints of mob history, noir films, hard-boiled paperbacks, and two-fisted pulp fiction with mystery writer and make-believe detective Stephen Gomez. Grab your fedora and button your lip as you enter the office of the internet's finest fictional detective agency, the Noir Factory.
To be an effective criminal defense counsel, an attorney must be prepared to be demanding, outrageous, irreverent, blasphemous, a rogue, a renegade, and a hated, isolated, and lonely person. Few love a spokesperson for the despised and the damned. Clarence Darrow. I want to warn you up front, today's case is about a murder, and not just any murder, but the murder of a child. Now, I know we call ourselves the Noir Factory, but we don't usually make it a practice to dwell on the darker aspects of mankind. But today we are. So if you find such subject matter unseemly, we'll understand, and I'd ask you to skip this case and visit us again next time when we'll speak of movie stars and con men and G-men. All set? So we'll go ahead and we'll begin our story at the beginning. Nathan F. Leopold Jr. was born on November 19, 1904 in Chicago to Nathan and Florence Leopold. The elder Nathan was the son of Samuel and Babette, Jewish immigrants from Germany who'd brought their family to Michigan. He worked in shipping, and he'd made a fortune. Their son Nathan had moved to Chicago and had married Florence Foreman in 1892. Nathan Leopold Sr. was already wealthy, but he had a gift for making more. He started up many successful enterprises in Illinois, such as Leopold and Austrian, a lending company, and the Manitou Shipping Company, a copper mining company, as well as the Fiber Can Corporation, a paper mill in Morris, Illinois. Leopold Sr. was an active member of the community. He was president of the Young Men's Hebrew Association in Chicago, one of Chicago's first bankers. And when he married Florence, he married into one of the most prestigious families in Illinois. As a reflection of the wealth and prestige he enjoyed, he moved his family into the Kenwood neighborhood in Chicago. The Kenwood area was famous for its large tree-lined boulevards and its proximity to the Loop and the meatpacking districts. Chicago's financial and cultural elite made their homes there, and Leopold's home had been built by Charles B. Van Kirk, one of the founders of the Chicago Board of Trade. It was there that Leopold Sr. and his wife started their family. Nathan Freudenthal Leopold Jr. was born on November 19, 1904. The third son of the senior Leopold, Nathan was recognized as a bright child right from the beginning. He moved quickly through grade school, and he mastered a handful of languages, and he excelled at all things academic. With a reported intelligence quotient score of 210, it was evident to all that he was an extraordinarily bright but less than humble young man. He was a subject of interest for bullies in grade school, and he had trouble making friends, and more often than not, he found comfort in reading. He took an interest in birds, and he studied them with a keen eye. By the time he was a teenager, he was one of the leading amateur ornithologists in the country, publishing 2 papers in the Auk, the leading ornithological journal in the United States. Leopold's interest in birds, however, seemed more intellectual than affectionate. As a young boy, his nurse was reportedly shocked to see him brutally killing birds without remorse, so he could add them to his pinboard. At a private Harvard school, his advancement took on a more rapid pace, and he was admitted to the University of Chicago at age 15 with an interest in ornithology. He graduated with honors in 1923 and returned the following year to the University of Chicago to pursue a graduate degree. And he was 18 years old at the time. Richard Loeb was born on June 11, 1905 in Chicago. Like Nathan Leopold, he too came from a privileged background. His father was a wealthy lawyer who had become a senior executive at Sears, Roebuck and Company, and he was worth an estimated $10 million near the turn of the century. His family took their holidays in a posh vacation house called Castle Farms, but during the year they stayed in their estate in Kenwood, the same neighborhood as the Leopolds. Richard Loeb was the third of 4 children, and he was an extremely bright young man, like Leopold. He was pushed forward in his studies by a strict nanny, and he jumped over 3 grades. Unlike Leopold, he was well-liked and he was popular, but he was uninterested in his studies and more interested in getting into trouble. He shoplifted and he committed acts of vandalism and arson, and he often lied or relied on his personality to get him out of suffering the consequences. He also graduated high school early, and he went to the University of Chicago before transferring to the University of Michigan during his sophomore year. There, he became the University of Michigan's youngest graduate at the time, at 17 years old. But despite that distinction, he was considered a lazy student who was often distracted by dime store novels. It was also said he was obsessed with crime. After receiving his bachelor's degree, he went on to graduate school at the University of Michigan, where again he struggled. He cared little about his studies, and he became an alcoholic. He left Michigan, and he returned to a more familiar setting, the University of Chicago. After returning to Chicago, Loeb reestablished his relationship with Leopold. The two men were from the same neighborhood, and they were both young rising stars. They'd known each other growing up, and they were casual friends, but now they had developed an immense attraction for each other. Leopold was brilliant and engaging. He spoke 5 languages, and he was quick-witted, and he appeared quite confident. In reality, he was insecure, constantly bragging about his knowledge and telling people that he'd mastered 15 different languages, about 5 more than he actually knew. Nathan Leopold saw in Richard Loeb what society saw in Richard Loeb. He exuded confidence that Leopold faked. He was charming, intelligent, and easy to talk to. Loeb was a good-looking young man, tall, slender, and people felt at ease with him. Nathan Leopold had a hard time with people. The two fell into a relationship rather quickly. Loeb saw himself as a criminal mastermind, and he needed a follower, someone to look up to him. Nathan Leopold was more than happy to be that person. In college, the two men fell in love with the philosophical idea of Friedrich Nietzsche, particularly the concept of the Übermensch, or Superman. What Nietzsche promoted was dismissing religion and other worldly rewards and embracing this worldliness. Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch as a goal humanity should set for itself. This person, in theory, would transcend the moral values of society, rising above them. The greatness of this person, by virtue of, their greatness really, would define good or evil by their actions, if not by the beliefs of society. In short, the supermen were beyond good and evil. They could not be judged by society. They were above normal men. And it was a philosophy that both Leopold and Loeb felt comfortable with. Loeb continued with his destructive, purposeless behavior. He stole cars to joyride, he broke storefront windows, and he set fires. But this time he had a partner, someone to cheer him on. Loeb loved that Nathan saw him as dangerous, and that fed the self-image he had of his master criminal. Leopold saw Richard as someone who brought out the best qualities in him. They became enthralled with Nietzsche's philosophy of Superman. Loeb so much that he was described as tedious in speaking about it. They quickly became comfortable in thinking of themselves as supermen, and considered the outdated moralities of society to be beneath them. They were the ones who would define their own morality. And as for supermen such as them, whatever brought them pleasure was moral. The crimes the two committed, the small fires, the window breaking, the petty theft, had gone unreported. And that irked Loeb. He wanted to commit a crime that was so sensational it would rock the city of Chicago. Loeb toyed with the idea of a kidnapping to see if they could do it, and Leopold quickly got on board. They spent months between classes discussing the crime and the details. They decided on a $10,000 ransom, but they were unsure who their victim would be. In the end, they decided to leave it to fate. The plan was to kidnap a child of a wealthy businessman, one who could easily pay the ransom. They would then instruct the father to board a commuter train in Chicago and throw the ransom out once the train reached the elevated tracks west of Lake Michigan. The two would be waiting in a car below to make a speedy getaway. On the afternoon of May 21st, 1924, the two men rented a car and they drove around their parents' Kenwood neighborhood, searching for their victim. After spending hours looking and coming up short, the two men were about to abandon their plans for the day when they found their prey, a 14-year-old boy walking alone. Leopold drove the car while Loeb called to the boy by name. He knew the boy's name because the boy was his cousin, young Bobby Franks. Loeb knew the boy's father well. He knew that he was wealthy, and he knew he would pay the ransom. "Hello, Bob," Loeb said as he smiled to the young man. "I'll give you a ride." "No, I'll walk," said the boy. He was close to home. Under the pretense of being interested in his tennis match, Loeb asked the boy if he would get in the car so they could drive around the block and talk. Franks, having no reason to fear his cousin, got in the back seat. Almost immediately, Loeb brought down a chisel onto Bobby Franks' head, stunning the boy. He hit him 3 more times before Franks finally lost consciousness. In order to keep the boy quiet, Loeb shoved a rag into his mouth, cutting off his air. Soon, Franks was dead in a pool of his own blood, and Loeb was covered in cast-off splatter. The two men took the body to a remote culvert several miles south of Chicago, and they dumped him in the brush. They used acid to clumsily burn his hands and face so his identity wouldn't be discovered. They'd chosen the location because they thought the odds of the body being discovered were remote. The two had plans to send the ransom note that day, with a note set to arrive at 8 o'clock the next morning. After they left the body, they spent hours cleaning their rental car. The two then burned the bloody clothes and rags. They left, thinking they'd committed the perfect crime. And unknown to Leopold, he left his eyeglasses next to the body. The note was delivered, and the authorities were called. The next morning, a passerby discovered the body, and he reported it. By the afternoon, word had spread, and the perfect crime was no longer perfect. Leopold and Loeb no longer harbored any thoughts of ransom money. Instead, their plan was to lie low. The victim of their crime was from a prominent Chicago family, and the nature of the crime was so abhorrent that the state's attorney, Robert Crowe, supervised the case himself. There was a tip that a gray sedan was seen in the vicinity, and beside the body, a pair of eyeglasses were found. The eyeglasses were taken to the funeral home, where Bobby's body was being processed for services. Initially, investigators assumed that the glasses belonged to Franks, but they were told he didn't wear glasses. The glasses were an ordinary prescription, but the hinges on the glasses were quite unusual. After checking with eyeglass shops around the Chicago district, they found that only 3 people in the area had purchased such glasses. The first was a woman with a solid alibi. The next was a businessman who'd been out of the country during the time of the murder. The last was Nathan Leopold. Crowe doubted that Leopold had anything to do with the crime. He was an educated young man, also from a prestigious family. They didn't do things like murder children. Still, he ordered 3 detectives to bring in Leopold for questioning. Nathan Leopold seemed comfortable being questioned by the police. When he was confronted with the glasses, he told the police that he was a well-respected bird expert, and he had regularly led birding expeditions near the area where the body was found. He told the investigators he must have dropped his glasses while birdwatching. When asked about his whereabouts the day of the murder, Leopold said that he and Richard Loeb were out riding around in his red Willis Knight automobile. He said they had a few drinks, and they picked up a couple girls. He told the police that they'd fooled around with the girls, but let them out when they refused to have sex with him. Crowe still had his doubts about Leopold's guilt, but he decided to hold on to him for as long as he could. Leopold's father, believing his son had nothing to fear from the DA, agreed to everything they asked for. The DA had local police go through Leopold's room. Inside, they found a note confessing his love and dedication to Loeb. In his mind, that threw doubt that the boys could be possibly cruising around for women. When Crowe questioned the family mechanic about Leopold's car, the red Willis Knight, the mechanic trying to help the family out, offered that the boys couldn't have been driving around since the red Willis Knight was in the shop, unavailable to Leopold. The information killed Leopold's alibi, and it sent police to local car agencies. Finding the boys had rented a gray sedan, identical to the one eyewitnesses placed at the scene, Crowe had Loeb brought in for questioning. Initially, both men acted with the same amount of bravado, imagining that questions of such ordinary men had little impact on such ubermensch as themselves. But soon it began to dawn on both men that they were being questioned separately. Loeb felt secure that Leopold's devotion would protect him from prosecution, but it was beginning to dawn on both men that devotion wasn't the shield they'd hoped for. They each broke, and they confessed to the murder, telling the DA that the other men had instigated the crime. Leopold told his attorney the killing was an experiment. It was easy to justify such a death as it is to justify an entomologist killing a beetle on a pin. Both men were charged with murders, and their families, as well as the world, now knew the truth. The trial of the century, as it was called, was a misnomer. The men had pled guilty to the crime. What was left for a judge to decide was their ultimate fate. New Jersey had the death penalty, and firing squads as well as hangings were still an option. The case made headlines from Nova Scotia to Miami, and the entire world was captivated by the story. Two privileged boys flouting the laws of a democratic society irritated the public. The fact that they didn't seem to care what the public thought of them maddened them. Newspaper reports that the two acted with no remorse and a cavalier attitude, seemingly oblivious to society's disgust, sent them wild. The case lived in the headlines for days, as pictures of the smirking, unrepentant killers only spurred on the bloodlust of an American public. Crowe felt certain he could deliver a death sentence to the two spoiled, privileged killers, and in the process, elevate his profile on a national stage. The parents of both Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb felt otherwise. With their children's guilt no longer in question, they knew that if their sons had any hope left in the world, it would be to hire some sort of miracle worker to handle the penalty phase of the trial. And with that, Clarence Darrow entered the picture. Clarence Darrow was a local defense attorney who had built his reputation on a defender of the weak and downtrodden. Known as the attorney of the damned, Darrow turned from corporate law to labor attorney to defense attorney. He was known as one of the great orators in the nation. He had already garnered fame from his successful defense of socialist Eugene Debs, and he was quickly becoming a household name for his strong opposition to the death penalty. Locally, Robert Crowe had gained first-hand knowledge of Darrow when the man had embarrassed him in a local corruption case. Darrow saw the death penalty as barbaric and vengeful. He did not consider the penalty as a deterrent, and he saw it as a way to satisfy the bloodlust of an angry mob. He decided that an insanity defense was inappropriate. The test at the time would be that the defendants could not distinguish right from wrong. In many previous circumstances, both men had described themselves as very educated and thoughtful. He also thought it was a bad idea to ask the court to try each man separately. His idea was that each man had influenced the other, and having both men available to him, it would be easier to advance that theory if needed. It was also necessary for Darrow to move quickly. The case had been assigned to John Judge Caverly. Caverly was considered a liberal justice who had never ordered the death penalty if he had another option. It would have been easy for Darrow to ask for a continuance, but there was a good chance he would be placed on another justice's calendar. Darrow decided to play the hand he was dealt, and court opened on July 21st, 1924. With the absence of a jury trial, Darrow had only one person to convince. If he could turn the judge from death penalty to a minimum of 14 to life, he would have accomplished his goal. It was not going to be easy. With our looks and Darrow's brains, Leopold had said, I think we're going to get along pretty well. Darrow argued mental illness for his clients, different from a plea of insanity. With a battalion of expert psychologists, he argued that the defendants were abused and suffered from their situations. The argument was made that they were both privileged youth and they were given too much too soon in life. They were propelled through school and insulated from the world. The defense argued that there were also cases of sexual abuse in their past. The prosecution, for its part, called a share of expert witnesses as well. They were mostly neurologists who testified that the two men were sound of mind and free of mental disease or disorders. For their part, both Leopold and Loeb had heeded the advice of their counselor. Gone were the smirks and the sneers from their earlier dealings with authorities. They now looked like desperate, contrite young men with angelic faces. With their experts weighing in, the only thing left were closing arguments. Crowe decided that the evidence spoke for himself, and a brief summary was enough. Young murderers have been sentenced to death in Cook County. These young men of privilege should not be made an exception of. Once again, Clarence Darrow had other ideas. With a closing argument that could never exist today and could never be brought before a jury, Darrow argued the injustice of a death penalty. He spoke eloquently and emotionally. He spoke of the misguided philosophy that his clients believed in and the expectations thrust upon them, and of the educational system that sharpened their mind while callousing their hearts. And he probably wouldn't have been successful if he stopped there. But he didn't. Instead, he also spoke of society's need for a vengeance, an almost entertainment-like quality that vengeance took. He spoke of murder being evil, whether it was perpetrated by an individual or the state. Darrow ended a statement with a plea to the judge for leniency, as well as a stanza from the poet Omar Khayyam. It was said that the courtroom was silent as he finished his closing arguments. It was also said there was not a dry eye in the courtroom. In total, Clarence Darrow's closing arguments lasted 2 days, over 12 hours, and is considered one of the finest pieces of American jurisprudence. It also had a profound effect on his audience. Judge Keverly sentenced the two men to life plus 99 years, forsaking the death penalty. Darrow had saved his clients from the hangman, but they didn't seem any wiser for the experience. When they were led back to their cells, Loeb called for his jailers to get us 2 steaks, thick and juicy. Leopold said they should be smothered in onions. After the trial, Clarence Darrow went on to defend John T. Scopes against William Jennings Bryan in what was known as the Scopes Monkey Trial. He also represented 11 defendants of color in the Dr. Oswaldian Sweet murder. He became known as a great American orator, as well as the chief criminal attorney of his day. He passed away on March 13, 1938, from heart disease. His ashes were scattered, but there's a memorial for him in Hyde Park in Chicago, on a small bridge across from the University of Science and Industry. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were both ordered to serve their sentences in Statesville Prison in Joliet, Illinois. They initially were privileged inmates, receiving money from their families to purchase goods from prison stores. The two were kept apart, but still managed to maintain a relationship in prison. Eventually, the amount of money that made its way to the men was reduced to $5 a week. Loeb used some of his money to bribe a former cellmate, James E. Day, not to hurt him. With the loss of funds, Loeb was no longer able to pay Day. After several accounts of abuse and threats, Day was moved from Loeb's cell and placed in another. On January 28th, Day attacked Loeb with a straight razor, fatally stabbing him. It was said that Leopold volunteered for a blood transfusion, only to be turned away by doctors who felt it was a futile gesture. Richard Loeb's final words were, "I think I'm going to make it." Nathan Leopold went on to become a model prisoner, learning 12 additional languages to the ones he already spoke. He reorganized the prison library, offered his service as a teacher, and did volunteer work. While he was incarcerated, he wrote the book Life Plus 99, the memoirs of his life following the murderers. Critics called the book an attempt to rehabilitate his image. After numerous parole petitions, Leopold was released in March of 1958. After trying and failing to set up a charitable foundation, he relocated to Puerto Rico, where he worked as a hospital medical technician, and he married a retired florist. Known to the locals as Nate, he went on to earn his master's degree in the University of Puerto Rico. He became a researcher in both the Department of Health and did research with leprosy for the university's School of Medicine. In Puerto Rico, Leopold returned to his childhood interest, and he published a checklist of birds of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. He passed away in Puerto Rico in August 29, 1971, at age 66 from a heart attack. The lives and crimes of Leopold and Loeb have been the subject of many novels, including films like Meyer Levin's Compulsion and Alfred Hitchcock's Rope. That's it this week for the Noir Factory. Join us next time for true crime, hard-boiled fiction, and the best in noir. I'm Steve Gomez. Good night.
Psst, still there? This week's special Noir Factory Dakota message is coming right up. Crack the code by visiting thenoirfactory.com/key.
17, 25, 3, 22, 13, 3, 2, 6, 26, 10. That is all. For the key to this code, visit thenoirfactory.com/key. That's thenoirfactory.com/key. Also, if you have time, we would love it if you could leave a review for the podcast at Apple Podcasts. Reviews help us reach a wider audience, as well as spread our influence around the shadier parts of the web. Good night.